So everyone, and welcome to our Friday seminar after a little break and also amid some interesting weather today. We are delighted to have with us as our speaker today Dr. Eric Chi from Rice University, far away. Eric is currently an associate professor there at the Department of Statistics. Previously, he was an assistant professor at NC State, the Department of Statistics. He actually received his PhD also from Rice, and then he did a couple of postdocs before starting on as a faculty. Eric has varied research interests, and he has done interesting things, has done lots of good work with high quality publications, and he has received multiple awards for his work as well, including an NSF Career Award. He has also served on editorial boards of multiple journals, including JCPS, among others. His research interests generally center around statistical learning and numerical optimization, and their applications in analyzing large and complex data sets from biology and engineering applications. And today he's going to tell us about some of his recent interesting work on computational framework for robust structured L2 regression problems. So please join me in welcoming Eric.
Thanks. So thanks so much for the kind introduction, and appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about some recent work. This is work that is going to cover mainly from two different papers. So I just want to acknowledge my collaborators and kind of attribute which papers they worked on. So the first kind of the initial ideas about the framework I'm going to talk about today, that's joint work with Jocelyn Chi. She's currently a postdoc in the Department of Mathematics at UCLA. And then the second kind of follow-up work is work done with Ken Lang at UCLA. And my former student recently graduated, Xiaochen Liu. She's actually currently a postdoc at MD Anderson now with Wenyi Wang's lab. Okay, so I want to start out with some motivational problems for the framework that I want to tell you about today. Okay, so I'm particularly interested in situations where your data maybe is well modeled by, like, some fraction of your data is well modeled by kind of maybe a simple model, parametric model, but maybe not necessarily all of your data. Or you might be in the context where your data consists of sort of major modes or subgroups of points that are well described by some parametric models. Okay, so we'll start with a really contrived example first. Suppose we had just some the data here, and it's being generated from one of two different populations. Kind of a natural thing you'd want to do in a situation like this, if you want to kind of summarize and study what's going on, is you might want to just fit two different regression lines. Okay, of course, in practice, your data doesn't come to you color-coded according to their sort of latent groups. Okay, and if you sort of naively attempted to fit a simple model to the data, you get something that doesn't really do a good job of kind of describing either of kind of the subpopulations. Okay, so that's hopefully not a hard sell. Okay, that even though the underlying data, however, could be well described by a kind of a simple parametric model, right? Okay, it's just you need two of them, right? And you'd also need to identify kind of which data points belong to kind of which subsets of the population. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today is some ideas that build off of sort of very classic ideas for kind of automatically identifying subsets of your data, and so the two fit kind of that are kind of well described by parametric models. Okay? And we're going to be focusing particularly on linear models. So that was a really contrived example. Okay, total example. The second motivating scenario is a little bit more realistic. So, but it's also, I would say, not a particularly kind of challenging data set. Right. So here we have 2,000 observations, and we just want to fit a multiple linear regression model using 13 predictor variables. Okay. So when we teach our students, we walk through how the sort of the basic modeling assumptions that we need to fit the model. Okay, and then under these assumptions, the maximum likelihood estimator corresponds to least squares regression. Okay, and another thing that we kind of go over with our students is that we want, and once we fit the model, we can go back and check to see how reasonable are our assumptions. Okay, does it make sense to use a linear model to fit the data here? Okay, and one of the standard kind of easy tools to kind of do these diagnostics is a residuals plot. Okay, so that's what I'm showing here. And so you have the fitted values and then the residuals for each of the data points. And what we're supposed to see, of course, is that we should be seeing noise. So the residuals are just capturing kind of random scatter. Hopefully the linear model part, the linear predictor part summary is capturing kind of all the important systematic behavior. Okay, and that's not happening here, right? So our student would look at this and correctly say it's not appropriate to fit a linear model to all the data, okay? Because you definitely see some systematic trends sort of leaking into our residuals. Okay, right? But it turns out in this particular data set, there's a very large component of observations that are well described by the multiple linear model. Okay, it's just that's what's also tossed in here are points that aren't really well described by that linear model. Okay, and even though this is a very simple problem, it's actually somewhat non-trivial to kind of identify kind of what that subgroup is, right? Okay, so we want to be able to still use our linear model because it's doing a good job, but the challenge is that we just don't know which data points to apply to, right? So we really like an automatic procedure that can kind of simultaneously fit the model, but also kind of sift out and sort which data points I want to include in my model fit. All right, so the framework that we're going to use, it's not new, it's been around a long time. Generally belongs to the framework, these minimum distance estimators. Okay, so this shows up in kind of density estimation. So I want to approximate a density function, and I'm going to talk particularly about one special kind of min distance estimator, the L2E, the L2 distance estimator. So this is work that my advisor David Scott kind of introduced in the early 2000s, and the idea is that suppose we want to estimate fit some parametric model, okay, to my data. F is, let's say, some true unknown data generating distribution, and I want to find that model that lives in this family of parametric models that minimizes this discrepancy between the truth and kind of my model space, right? Okay, so this is not a practical thing to compute, okay? Well, because you don't know what F is, right? But we'll discuss that in a moment, how to deal with that, right? But this is the key idea here, and we're going to go through kind of some details about examples, kind of build up our understanding, kind of what's so good and what's not so good about this approach. What's good about the approach is that we're going to create some insensitivity to outliers. Of course, what's kind of the trade-off that you give up when doing any type of robust estimation is that you're going to lose statistical efficiency, because it's sort of baked into the way we set up the problem that we don't want to use all the data points in the fit. Okay, so we're going to downgrade or essentially kind of trim or throw away some of the data, and then hopefully what we get back is that we're good about, we make a good progress at kind of throwing away data points that maybe are not kind of well described by a good fraction of the data. All right, so this framework of the L2 distance estimator actually lives in a family of density power divergences, and so you can almost put, there's a parameter that kind of like walks you through the family of these district densities, divergences. And the L2 lives somewhere along that spectrum. Okay, and one end of the spectrum is the MLE, so high efficiency, low robustness, and the other end, as you move away from the MLE, you're trading off efficiency for robustness. Okay, so L2 lives somewhere along that spectrum. And so why this particular member of this family is because it's very computationally convenient. Okay, so we'll see, we're going to use some specific, there's some niceties that come along with kind of using this particular member of the family when it comes to computation. All right, so I want to go through some simple examples to sort of build our intuition and understanding kind of why using this criterion is possibly useful for our task. Okay, so the scenario is the following. So I observed some univariate data, and it's coming from a 3/4, 1/4 mixture of Gaussians, and I want to estimate a location scale. Okay, so I want to estimate a Gaussian density, and I want to fit one Gaussian density to this mixture distribution. Okay. And if I do the MLE, I do a kind of really bad job because it's the MLE is going to really struggle at trying to find one Gaussian that maximizes the likelihood over this mixture. Okay, in particular, it puts a lot of probability where there's no opt data, and then it does that at the expense of taking probability where there is data, right? Okay, so the MLE was trying to do is it's focused on trying to fit all the data points. Okay, we're trying to find one model that does a good job at explaining the variation in all the data. All right, and what we're going to see as we walk through some kind of work through this example, what the minimum distance estimator does instead, it's going to choose this member of the parametric family. Okay, and what we see is that it focuses all its attention on doing a really good job at fitting that parametric model to some fraction of the data. Okay, we didn't tell it what fraction of the data to use. Okay, that's kind of sort of the automatic part of the procedure. Okay, it does a very bad job of modeling this data, but doesn't care. Okay. So I would argue, this in some sense, like it's asking too much to account for everything. Okay, but in some sense, the data is simple. Okay, and the overly simplistic single parametric model can actually do a good job of kind of describing some fraction of the data. Okay. All right, so why is this? Let's kind of unpack the criterion to sort of understand why we get this behavior. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna specifically focus attention the rest of this talk on Gaussian models. Okay. And for this part of the derivation, we're still looking at the problem. Let's say just estimate a location. Okay, so we'll put back in the precision. The precision is going to be another thing that we need to talk about. But let's go ahead and plug in this kind of univariate toy example, the Gaussian. Okay, and so when we plug it into the criterion, okay, you can just expand out this quadratic, and we'll get 3 terms. Okay, so this term, thanks to the simple structure here, you can write down explicitly what this evaluates to. We have a cross term here, and then we have a term that involves just the unknown density. All right, so again, we can't estimate, we can't minimize this thing. If we could, that seems silly. We already have F. Okay, we have all the information we need. The hard thing is that we don't know what F is, the data generating probability. Okay, so when we express it like this, if we stare at this kind of cross term here, we realize that we can estimate this in an unbiased manner just with a sample mean. Okay. All right, so if you focus on the right hand side, you see that there's only one term that has dependency on the parameter we're trying to estimate. Okay, there's no dependency on the parameter here. So this is something that we can compute from the data and also directly minimize, because this is just a constant with respect to the parameter we're trying to estimate. Okay, all right. So this is our L2E estimator. Okay, we're going to find a minimizer to this kind of unbiased estimate of the minimum distance, integrated squared error. All right, so let's again kind of look a little bit more closely and take apart what this criterion is doing, and then we can see why this behaves the way it does. All right, so here's our L2E criterion. We have the sum end here, and what are we accumulating at each of the data points that we observe? We're accumulating and superimposing these inverse current Gaussian kernels. Okay. All right. So when I add up all the inverted Gaussian kernels, I get a criterion or objective function I'm trying to minimize that looks like this. Okay, so you'll notice 2 things about this. One is not convex. Okay, so in general, that's unfortunate. Okay. In this case, it's a good thing. Okay, we'll see in a moment kind of why you don't want to do something convex here. But you also see that there's 2 local minima. Okay, so the local minima here, the better one, the deeper one, that corresponds to fitting a parametric model that captures the majority class. Okay, and then the other local minima, however, is capturing a parametric model that goes well at summarizing the minority class. Okay? Right. So again, normally when, especially because of optimization, it's a very annoying thing when you have to deal with non-convex problems. Here, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like there actually is an interpretation for some of the local minima that are suboptimal. Okay, and you can kind of see how these objective functions are constructed, because we take each one of these inverted Gaussian kernels and we're gonna tack it on where we have data. Okay, and if you tack together a bunch of these Gaussian kernels, they'll merge together. Okay, so if you have a high density or collection of points, that's going to result in a deep valley and create a local minimum. Okay? And you see that since we have more data points here and we carefully chose our bandwidth parameter, okay, our precision parameter, things coalesce and we have this nice global minimizer that corresponds to kind of this main component. All right, so in general, I like convexity. Okay, if you do a lot of computation optimization, there's a lot of nice things that come along with convexity. But here in this case, this is really the wrong thing to do. Okay, so again, this is the resulting fit that we get. This density that does like a poor job modeling where the data is and poor job modeling where the data isn't. But if you look at the objective function, this is very nice. Okay? There's no local minima. There's one global minimizer. It's unique, but this is useless in this context. Okay, this is exactly the wrong answer. Okay, all right. So here this is a case where I think really ought to embrace non-convexity. Okay, so we have kind of a basic framework for understanding how to do parameter estimates, just that simple toy problem. Well, let's go back to the regression context. Okay, so how are we going to do regression using this alternative to MLE? Well, we're going to put a parametric model on our residuals. Okay, and again, our focus is on the Gaussian parametric family. Okay, so we'll go back in and let's add back in that scale parameter. Okay, so that's going to be pretty important. All right, and so if you plug in all the details here, the L2E criteria that we want to minimize, we want to estimate a regression coefficient vector beta and then a precision parameter tau, and then we're going to do that by minimizing this function. Okay, all right, and then what I'm particularly interested in is oftentimes, especially in the regression context, we have some prior knowledge, or we want to impose some prior structure, some structure on beta. Okay, and we can put some type of shrinkage penalty to enforce that. Okay, so the good question is, like, is there sort of some general principles that we can use to construct a way of kind of simply optimizing this, regardless of kind of what we plug in for this with penalty, as long as we're not too crazy about the penalty we choose. Okay, so that's sort of the main gist of this talk. All right, so just to put kind of in the context, like what's been done before and kind of what this work is contributing. Again, the L2E has been around for over 20 years. If you're one of David's students at a certain period of time, you probably worked on the L2E as part of your dissertation. But if you look at kind of what all of us did, they typically didn't work with particularly high dimensional models. We didn't have any kind of sparse structure that we maybe want to recover in our models. And for most part, if you're working on kind of simpler problems like that, all of us kind of use these black box solvers. Okay, all right, but I think this is a very powerful idea, and it was kind of surprising that there's not much work in kind of having a general tool that would just work easily with some nice algorithmic guarantees for a lot of problems that are appropriate for more modern data. Okay. All right, so I do need to say that there is some work on minimum distance estimators that are general. Okay. So in particular, these are so Sasha is in applied math at UW, and then Orly Lozano's at IBM in Yorktown. And they have kind of a series of papers looking at minimum distance estimators, and they're looking at primarily their general framework's the one with the trimmed estimator. Okay, all right. So this is very general. Okay, so this is something where you could drop in potentially have a wider range of problems and have this one computational framework for fitting the model and estimating the parameters. However, they have this trimming parameter, which they treat as a hyperparameter. And it's going to turn out this plays the same role as the precision parameter in the L2E criterion. So it's a parameter that we could potentially estimate and not have to treat as a hyperparameter. Okay. So they could do it too. There's some kind of technical issues that would make this hard to do, though, or kind of inconvenient from a computational framework using their framework. So this is something that working with the L2 buys you. As I said earlier, there's some computational conveniences that come with using this particular family of the minimum distance estimators. Okay. All right. So yeah, we want to be able to easily incorporate structure in our regression coefficients. And so the big thing that, again, I'm surprised that this hasn't been really done before. Just toss in that precision parameter as part of the estimation problem, and then let the data kind of help you determine kind of seamlessly when you're fitting everything kind of how to choose that. Okay, because it turns out this precision parameter it plays a very explicit role in trading off the efficiency and robustness. Okay. All right, so let's kind of walk through again some just simple examples to get kind of a good sense of that. Okay. All right, so let's go back to our really oversimplified toy example of our mixtures. I just want you to remember the color coding scheme. There's 2 regression lines fit just to each of the subpopulations. I'm going to encode that information for each of the regression coefficients in green and orange. And then I'm also going to color code the MLE estimate in purple. Okay. And what I want to do is I'm going to look at the L2E criterion optimization surface for different levels of the precision parameter. Okay, so there was some true underlying precision parameter that I used to generate the data. And I'm just going to look and see how the intercept and the slope parameter objective function surface changes as I kind of walk through kind of a low, small precision parameter value and a large one. Okay. So when the precision parameter is very small, I get a very convex looking set of level sets. Okay, and the global minimizer coincides with the MLE. Okay, and these kind of mixture component parameter values, they are not minimizers of this surface. Okay, but let's start to adjust the surface by changing the precision parameter. So let's inflate it a bit, and we see that as we inflate it, if we inflate it sufficiently large, the surface isn't convex anymore. Okay, but if I choose that precision parameter appropriately, the surface has 2 modes. And 2 local minima, and the 2 local minima are kind of equally good, right? And that kind of corresponds to the fact that originally I had 2 sets of data that are equally balanced, both well described by their own lines. Okay. Okay. And then what happens though is as I increase the precision parameter, the surface gets really rough. And it's just not a very friendly. This is like I would say this is a nice non-convex objective function minimizer. This is not a good one. Okay, right? Because it's very bumpy. Okay, so if you think about it, this is actually not terribly surprising to see these trends. If you look at the objective function, it's smooth, so you can investigate what happens when we make tau small. Okay, you just kind of look at the first order approximation. And when you just clean up the algebra, you see you get a least squares problem. Okay, so you see that the L2E solution tends towards the MLE as you take that precision parameter low. Okay. Now what happens on the other extreme, as you increase that precision parameter, each of those inverted Gaussian kernels, they're gonna tend towards a delta spike. Okay, and so your objective function ends up being kind of the superposition of a bunch of like downward spikes. Okay. Okay. So somewhere between the 2, hopefully you get a nice non-convex surface whose global minimizers are kind of doing a really good job summarizing a fraction of your data with your simple parametric model. Yeah.
Clearly is there in the one of the like very nice to see this continuous behavior. So is this going to be, is there a way to generally have this kind of precision parameters for other kind of families as well? I mean, here you have a natural candidate.
Yes, yeah.
For the changing between complexity and non-complexity.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. It would be very nice if that's the case. I'm interested in kind of thinking about that. So the good thing is the Gaussian is convenient for those reasons that you're saying. The other good thing is that there's still interesting problems that would be benefit from kind of using a Gaussian model. Not all the interesting data out there is probably appropriately described by Gaussian, and it's not clear like how you would generalize this framework to a non-Gaussian. Okay, so how are we going to fit the model? So in computational statistics, we're very fond of doing block coordinate descent or coordinate descent. So we're going to use that strategy. We're just going to alternate between fixing the precision parameter and the estimating the regression coefficients and vice versa. Right, so both of these problems actually turn out to be non-convex, okay, but they're kind of nice non-convex problems. Okay, so we can't write down in closed form what these are, but we can make a lot of progress, kind of approximately minimizing both of them. Okay, so I'll talk about how we're going to do that. So let's first focus on how we're going to estimate the regression coefficients. Right, so we use an algorithm to do this. So I just want to briefly review what that is. It's a very simple idea if you're not familiar with it already, and it should be in everyone's toolbox. Okay. So the idea here is that we have some function we want to minimize. Okay, so this is going to be our L2E criterion with respect to the regression coefficients. We have some. It's going to be iterative procedure, so we have some preliminary or current guess, right? And then we're going to construct a surrogate function based off our current guess. And this surrogate function just has to satisfy two pieces. It has to match the function we're actually trying to minimize at the last iterate, and then everywhere else it's got to be an upper bound. Okay. All right. So what we'll do is once we have this surrogate, we'll minimize this. And so this works if you can find a easy to minimize surrogate. Okay. All right. So what these two conditions give you is a very numerically stable algorithm. Okay. You're always making kind of progress towards finding a minimizer. Okay. So at your last iterate, it matches your surrogate function at the anchor point. You do your minimization, so you're doing better than your last iterate, and then because of the domination condition, where you are after you take the step, the optimization from minimizing the surrogate, your overall and you're doing better than where you were before. All right, so I think a lot of folks are interested. We're familiar with the EM algorithm. It's a special case of the MM where you're constructing these surrogate functions using Jensen's inequality. All right, so in pictures, it's probably a little bit easier to see. Let's say I want to minimize the black curve. What I'll do is I have some preliminary guess for the parameter tau. I'll construct a surrogate function in red here. That's easy to minimize. It's just a quadratic. I get a new iterator estimate for tau. I just repeat the process, and eventually I'll go where I want to go. All right, so the MM idea, you can ask the questions like, okay, this sort of makes sense, but you have a lot of freedom in choosing this surrogate function. Okay, so you can start to ask the question like, what's a good surrogate versus a not so good surrogate? Okay, so here I'm showing our kind of our inverted Gaussian kernel, okay, and then this is one quadratic surrogate function, and I would argue you can actually do better than this, right? Okay, I would argue this quadratic function is a better surrogate function. Okay, and what makes it better is that it satisfies both of the red and the purple satisfy the tangency condition. Okay, but I would say the purple curve is doing better with respect to the domination. Right? Remember the domination condition is. Bless you. Domination condition is that the surrogate function has to live above the function that you're trying to minimize everywhere. Okay, so this is not really a tight notion, but in some sense. If you can kind of make this gap when they're not equal to each other smaller, you're doing a better job of approximating the function you're actually trying to minimize with the surrogate function. Okay, so in that sense, this sharper majorization, okay, which kind of sits below all the other majorizations that have the same shape, in this case quadratic, and then are anchored to the function I want to minimize at the same point. This magenta one is kind of superior. Okay. All right, so what we're going to do is for the L2E problem, for the regression coefficient part, we're going to try to get a sharp quadratic majorization. Okay, so this is the building block is the univariate one. Okay, so what I'm showing here is this is just a basic fact. If you have a function that's concave and differentiable, its first order Taylor approximation is a global overestimator. Okay, so this is a very common building block for majorizations. If you're using, let's say, folded concave penalties. And so we have in particular, a specific concave differentiable function. Okay, if you look at the Gaussian kernel, okay, if you kind of break it up into two pieces, we're computing residuals and squaring them, and then we're piping them into this function, right? Okay, so this function, what we could do is we can upper bound it and construct this linear majorization. And here and then once we have that linear majorization, we can pipe back in the residuals. Okay, all right, and then it's not that hard to show, but this ends up being the sharpest univariate quadratic majorization, okay, for any one given one of those summands in the L2E criterion. Okay, all right, so this is not the sharpest multivariate quadratic majorization that we could compute, okay, but it's a lot better than sort of some naive quadratic ones that we used in the first paper. Okay, so this is one of the main contributions, kind of working the details of this out in the second paper. Okay, all right, so if we focus on the regression problem, getting the regression coefficients on the differentiable part, not the penalty part. And we use that univariate quadratic majorization, and we just kind of clean things up. We get a very nice, not scary, simple looking weighted least squares problem. Okay? Right, and the weights are residuals based on your last prediction, and you have they're Gaussian kernels, okay, and this is very easy to interpret what's going on here. If this is our last model, our last iterate model, the points that don't contribute much, that are downweighted in our weighted least squares problem, are the points that are like not well described by our last model. Okay, so they don't really contribute to the fit. Okay, all right. So if you've done anything with robust estimators, oftentimes you'll use some type of iteratively weighted least squares. So it's not surprising to see this crop up here. Okay. All right, so if you go through the derivation of those algorithms, they're probably actually doing some type of majorization that kind of is very similar in spirit to what we just did. All right, so we're interested in posing some extra structure on our regression coefficients, but this is an easy problem to solve. Okay, so if we can even just kind of partially minimize this, we have a good building block for estimating our regression coefficients. Okay. All right, so the key thing, so the algorithmic primitive to how to compute this problem or approximately compute the solution to this problem is the proximal map. So if you're not familiar with this, the proximal map of phi, which you can think of our regularizer, it's a solution to a very simple regularized regression problem. There's identity to design. You can imagine this is our penalty. This could be a lasso, for example. Okay, and then the mapping takes the minimizer of this function. Okay, so when there's no regularization, the proximal mapping is the identity map. If phi is encoding a constraint, okay, so we want to find the u that is closest to x in Euclidean distance subject to u belonging to some set C. We can write that in terms of this indicator function. It's different from the indicator function that we use in probability. This function is 0 for all x that are in C and infinity otherwise. Right. So in that case, the proximal mapping reduces to Euclidean projection onto the set C. Okay. Right. So for a lot of constraints that we care about in statistics, that this projection can either be written down in closed form or computed very efficiently. All right, and then of course, what if our regularizer is a lasso? This will give us that the proximal mapping is sort of the well-known soft shrinkage operator. Okay, any questions so far? All right, so that's updating our regression coefficient vector. Okay, so we reduce the problem of estimating the regression coefficient vector to solving a very simple regularized weighted least squares problem. How about updating our precision parameter, estimating that? So this part, I'm not going to go through the details about this, but I do want to just say that we turn the precision parameter has to be positive, right? So usually open sets are not fun to work with for optimization constraints, but there's a very simple kind of trick we could do that's common. We just reparameterize this. Okay, so we're gonna just in the actual algorithm we use this reparameterization so that the parameter we estimate is unconstrained. Okay. And then, this problem is all differentiable. It's just a univariate problem, so we can use a quasi-Newton method to minimize it. All right, so altogether, the framework is very simple. Okay, so we have some preliminary model. Okay, we're going to compute weights. Okay, we're going to transform our data, and then we set up a weighted penalized regression. We solve that, and then once we have our new regression coefficients, we fix that, and then we take a couple of quasi-Newton steps to update our precision parameter. Okay. Now we have new model parameters, beta and tau. We can compute the residuals and then recompute new weights and reweight the data and then repeat. Okay, so what's the framework is pretty straightforward, and it also comes with some nice convergence guarantees. Basically, I should say you're part of the modest regularity conditions. So this result holds when that regularization penalty is the main assumption is that it's convex. Okay, and this mainly has to do with the fact that we use kind of the properties of proximal maps of convex functions. Okay, when you get rid of that, we're gonna have to kind of use a different kind of strategy for proving these things. But what do we show? Okay, so as long as your regularizers, let's say convex, you generate a sequence. You generate a sequence of iterates. Okay, this is going to go somewhere nice. Okay, it's going to tend towards a first order stationary point, okay, of the objective function. Okay, so all the local minima are first order stationary points. Okay. All right, and then if it turns out that you only have finally many of these first order stationary points, then you're guaranteed something a little bit stronger. You're guaranteed that you'll converge to one of them. Okay, and so this result is particularly useful if you're in the context where you want to do a mixture type of modeling and you believe there's some major modes in your data. And so each of those modes of the data will correspond to one of those stationary points. And what this says is that you can just start your iterative process somewhere. It's going to find one of those modes. Okay, and then that suggests sort of an iterative process for kind of taking your data apart. Okay, once you find that mode, you've identified a subset of your data. You could remove that data and just kind of repeat the process. Okay, all right. So that's not a novel idea. Like there's similar ideas like this before, but this result here kind of gives assurances that it's kind of going to do the right thing. Okay. All right. So kind of taking a step back and just kind of looking at the whole procedure. This is flexible in the sense that as long as you can solve this penalized weighted least squares problem, and for a lot of regularizers or shrinkage penalties, this is kind of straightforward. You can apply kind of that generic algorithm. Okay, so sort of as a meta algorithm. Okay, so it's a meta algorithm around like if you have a solver for this problem here. Okay, and again, we have the convergence results apply for when this guy is convex, but the second paper explores and kind of shows that for a lot of non-convex penalties you can actually do better. Okay, and this is also not that much harder to compute in that case. Okay, the guarantees, that's a different issue. Okay. All right, so we'll just go through a little toy example, illustrative examples, to kind of show the kind of how you would use this framework. Okay. So let's say you can encode in this penalty function a constraint that you're trying to estimate kind of a convex shaped function, or you're trying to estimate a monotonic function. Okay, so it's kind of an easy way to automatically robustify these things. So here are our underlying signals. These are very simple examples just to kind of show what's going on. Our underlying signal is this convex function here. I get to observe some noisy perturbations on it at different samples of x. And if I fit an L2E or an MLE estimate for either of them, they both kind of give the same answer. They both do kind of equally well. Again, this is a bit cartoonish, but suppose I perturb some of the observations kind of pretty far away from the truth, and you can see not surprising that the MLE gets kind of dragged at this point where the estimates get biased towards those outliers, whereas the L2E estimates If you look closely, it's also being dragged a little bit. These points are contributing a little bit to the fit, but not nearly as much as not nearly as much as the MLE. Okay, so it's less sensitive to that. Okay. You can do the same thing for this isotonic function here. Again, when the data is the smooth trend plus some Gaussian noise, both the estimators do kind of similarly. You have some gross outliers here, and again, the MLE, predictably, it gets kind of biased towards the outliers, whereas L2E is a little bit insensitive to that. All right, so the next two slides are just kind of some brief comparisons between the first and second paper. I'm not going to go through the details about the PG is the work from the first paper, and then MM is the second paper. LS is least squares. As you increase, in the case of the isotonic regression, if you increase the number of outliers, it's not surprising the MLE is super sensitive to outliers. Everything's kind of sensitive, but the two estimators that are based on the L2E are less sensitive. There is some differences between the version 1 and version 2. They're not solving exactly the same problem, so you're not going to get exactly the same results. So there were some improvements going from this iteration to this iteration. Yeah. Yeah, they're slightly different problems. So the first paper, it's a little clunkier. We put box constraints on the tuning, the precision parameter. So in principle, you could kind of minimize the gap by playing around with that. I don't think we did that here, and that's why you see this discrepancy. Yeah, but yeah, they're doing a slightly different. Okay. All right, but so the big, so there is some improvements in the kind of the estimate you get back out, but so the big take-home point for moving from iteration this one to the second version is the runtime. So you can look at the papers where we kind of do some more experiments, kind of breaking down where the time savings are coming from, and a lot of it is coming from having to take fewer steps, okay, because you're using that sharper majorization. Okay, so this is particularly pleasing because we're for the algorithm, you have to kind of solve multiple rated least squares, structured least squares problems compared to, let's say, the least squares estimate, but you're actually not paying a huge price. Okay, you converge pretty quickly in outer iterations, whereas the previous algorithm was using a much more conservative surrogate function, so you had to do lots of more outer iterates of kind of your baseline solver to get kind of comparable answers. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Applying your describe method, the underlying functions for like how you are estimating them. It's no longer linear model.
That's right. Yeah. So even though I call it least squares, it's not least squares. I have a constraint. So just really briefly, in the isotonic. So I want to minimize this, but then I have a monotonicity constraint. So yeah, it's not straight up least squares. Okay. Yeah, I want my my observed responses I want to model it with kind of a noiseless version. Okay, so this model is that it's I have my data is coming from this, and this kind of underlying trend has this monotonicity constraint. Okay. And there's a similar kind of constraint set for the convex regression case. Okay, so but it's not terribly complicated, but it's more complicated than isotonic. Okay. All right. Okay. So what I want to kind of end with in terms of the applications of this is sort of illustrative real data example. Okay, so I wouldn't say that you need to use anything sophisticated in this case. You can just plot the data. Okay, but as you can see, I kind of like to use simple examples because I can see what's going on. Okay, so this is a data set where each of the data points here corresponds to a star. We record both the temperature and the light intensity of it. And in general, the hotter the star is, the brighter it is. But there are a couple of stars, these 4 stars that are different. Okay, they're kind of lower temperature, but are brighter. Right. So if you run the L2E on this, you're going to get this red line that captures sort of the main trend of kind of how most of the stars behave in terms of their light and the temperature, and ignores these 4 points. The dashed line is kind of what you would get if you just fit the least squares. But part of the process, a byproduct of the process, we're computing these weights. Okay, and these weights can actually help you read off and provide diagnostics about which data points are used in the model fit and which ones aren't. Okay, so it's very straightforward. It's not extra computation. This is being computed as you're moving along. So this is a histogram of the resulting weights from the fits here, and you can see very clearly, this is on a log scale, that there's 4 points which correspond to these 4 stars that were not really basically not included in this model fit. Okay. Right. So again, for this problem, it's overkill to do anything else. Like you would just plot the data and then, you can just kind of conveniently erase these points, right? Okay. But even for that bank data I showed earlier, and that's not a very high dimensional problem. There's only 13 predictors. I mean, you can certainly start looking at pairwise plots and things like that and see if you can find these things. But those points are also not nearly as grossly separated out as those. Okay. So you don't have to go to a very kind of challenging data set to kind of appreciate that it's nice to have an automatic procedure that will kind of simultaneously fit the model, identify the outliers. A key part of identifying outliers is kind of getting that precision parameter correct, but that's part of the estimation process. Okay, so I'll go ahead and just kind of wrap up with kind of the sort of the key points. Again, I was particularly interested in I just felt that there needed to be sort of a general computational framework so that L2E could work with all your favorite penalized regression estimators. And then it turned out once you write that out, it's like, oh, you can also estimate the precision parameter, and that's actually very, very important if you want to kind of fit fractions of your data, because you need to choose that properly so that the procedure homes in a kind of like the homogeneous parts of your data automatically. Okay, and then there's some details to work out, but it was actually it's kind of a natural strategy to kind of compute these things. And again, sort of a nice bonus about that is you don't need to assume a whole lot about your regularizer to guarantee that your iterate sequence is going to be well behaved, that your algorithm is going to converge. All right, so Abhishek asked a really good question, kind of in terms of future work. A lot of this is all hard baked into a Gaussian model. There's a lot of other kind of appropriate models for data out there. Let's say if you had count data, how would you do this with, let's say, Poisson? I don't know exactly. That's kind of an open area. The Gaussian has a very nice, as Abhishek said, the precision parameters is easy to work with, but if you move to other models, it's not clear what to do. Okay, I mentioned earlier kind of non-convex regularizers. They actually do a lot better for a lot of structured regression problems. This is not something new, and it also holds in the case of when you want to adapt these procedures for doing robust regression. You have to change the proof technique to kind of work out the convergence. So that's something that would be nice to be able to work out. And everything I talked about today was also computational. It would be nice to see if some the statistical properties we know about, let's say, our penalized estimators, do they hold, and kind of can you see explicitly the robustness trade-off with the efficiency in those cases. So those are directions I think that I'm interested in kind of further pursuing. So in terms of kind of the work, the first paper is in this JCGIS article. Kind of the better majorization. That's in technometrics. I didn't talk about this today, but we also adapted this with one of my other students, Chong Hung at NC State, for doing tensor regression. Okay, not tensor regression, tensor decomposition. So this is not Xiaochen. This is Yufeng Liu at UNC. So the preprint of that's an archive. And then there's a L2E package on CRAN. Both of the method frameworks are implemented, but the default's to the better one. Okay, so you can go to Jocelyn's website. There's actually some tutorials and vignettes if you want to try this out. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention and happy to answer questions.
Very good, very nice talk. First.
Yeah.
So you said that for non-convex characterizers, the theory of this is have you tried
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it does. Like, I even know kind of the framework we should use. I just haven't worked it out. Yeah.
the secondary question, like of those penetrative groups that can't hold up
Yeah.
I'm sure you have some default values probably. And I'm sure it's solid.
Yeah, that's right.
Understanding of how to put them, what they should be, like to keep this
That's kind of what we do. It doesn't the convergence theory is agnostic to that. So you could do whether you do a one-time inner loop iteration or you do 1,000. No, it's not really worth it. Yeah. So this is just a general feature also of MM algorithms. A lot of MM algorithms, the majorization-minimization step, it's going to be something where you can write down in closed form what it is. But even if you can't, if you just take one sort of decent improvement, that doesn't actually change the overall kind of asymptotic convergence rate in general, versus like iterating and actually minimizing the majorization as you're moving it. So if you look at the kind of the wall clock time, then you're just better off doing usually 1 or 2 steps. Yeah. In practice, what we do, I don't know, we do 10 or 5. I think the default's like 5, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a very nice idea. I think you're going to show that using the event algorithm, you have a greater order of computation as opposed to if you drop the event part.
Versus what?
If you drop the event part, direct optimization.
Oh, okay. So for
do you have any order of improvement?
Yeah, okay. So I can tell you really quickly the cost of doing the least squares. So it's buried in this. So I can answer that really quickly. Okay, so if I were just gonna solve this directly using gradient descent, okay, so I need to compute the gradient. That has the same kind of per iteration complexity as the MM algorithm. Okay, so you can kind of think the MM is doing like the least squares part. It's doing you can kind of think of it as doing kind of a variation on gradient descent. So that's sort of the baseline comparison against the complexity of gradient descent. Okay, if you do something else, I don't know, you could maybe do better than the MM, but that's kind of the most, like if you're going to directly minimize this smooth function, that would be the comparison.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So some of the motivations that you were giving for considering this approach is you have a few outliers, right? You don't care about which are causing a little peak somewhere else. But suppose you actually have a proper mixture, like a real mixture, right? Right now you're comparing with the least squares all the time, right? But suppose you have a proper mixture and you are interested in understanding both the peaks, right? You go for your method. So first of all, I'm interested in understanding what it will recover or how it will behave. And more importantly, you can go traditional and create like a Gaussian mixture model or something, right? So how this method would compare to that one? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think it's a little bit of a wash. Like the one challenge with the Gaussian mixture model is like, how do you pick the number of components? I didn't talk about it too much. I briefly mentioned you could use this sort of greedy strategy where you iteratively kind of strip off components that you might learn using the L2E method. So the benefit of that is that you don't need to head into the problem pre-specifying the number of components. I think on kind of problems that are like easy, like the Gaussian mixture model and this, you're going to get similar answers. So just from a parameter choosing point of view, it's a little easier. It's just kind of convenient to use the L2E. I think probably a more interesting questions are the theoretical thing. So there's some gaps. I said a little bit casually, like, oh, you'll be able to find some component. I mean, there's some details to work out. So I feel like in order to make some type of comparison with like a mixture model, like using kind of a classic traditional mixture model, maybe we want to fill in those things, and then you can make some argument that then the L2E is very nice because you don't have to pre-specify these things, and you can guarantee you're going to pick off each of the components. But that's not done yet.
To me, that the scale here, like tau, so that parameter is pretty important in your algorithm. So I was wondering, have you thought about extending the Gaussian to elliptical distribution? So for elliptical distributions, you also naturally have like a location and a parameter, but you do not have a particular form like you have for Gaussian. So I was thinking if the extension is possible.
Yeah, so this will probably actually partly answer a little bit. So that's one thing that I think a Gaussian mixture can beat on this. Like, so it can capture better, like kind of a scatter kind of information. Like this is very naive. It's kind of isotropic. A Gaussian mixture model would probably do a lot better because they can have flexibility to kind of estimate the covariances. So I have thought about it. I think that would be a lot harder. If I wanted to kind of model kind of a more complicated covariance structure. Yeah, it's an interesting idea, but I don't know how to do it.
Yeah, actually, what does the method do when you have, let's say, more than situations of similar sizes?
Yeah, it depends on where you initialize. So if things work the way we want to, each of the different components, let's say you had 3 or 4, and you just randomly initialize, and it would home in on one of them. Okay, and then you could look at the weights post-processing and then see kind of which points belong to that component, which ones don't.
Statistically speaking, it could have multiple improbability specifically to go to either one of those, centers of the different.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So maybe I misunderstood. You still need global mapping to POS data. Or like you mentioned that you found a local, your algorithm is a local algorithm, you found a local minimizer, you export the data around it, and you found another one. So what you evaluate you found all the local minimizers, and then you evaluate all the local minimizers on the local one.
Yeah, so I was a little bit sloppy about this. I called the L2E estimator the minimizer, like the global minimizer. In practice, usually we're just happy to get a local minimizer. So as long as that scale parameter, you're able to successfully sort of estimate that for one of the components, you'll do a pretty good job of kind of identifying a group of data points. So what we'll end up doing kind of in practice, what you would do if you are in a kind of a mixture of components scenario, you use the resulting weights afterwards to figure out which points were used to fit in the model, and then you can like pull them out and then kind of recursively apply the method. And at some point, you really don't have a good, well-defined population. You're just going to junk out. So that's not really a formal argument for how to do things, but that's kind of in practice what would happen, and I would use this.
Are there any other questions for Eric? Well, if not, let's get it.